The Concord Assembly had rules about humans. Kale Vasic knew them by heart because he'd helped draft 6 of them, lobbied against 4, and broken at least 2 on the way to breakfast this morning. Rule 11 said human delegates could not carry fermented beverages into the resonance chamber. Kale had a flask of rye whiskey tucked into his boot. Not because he planned to drink it during proceedings, but because the Tessari delegate had once told him that the smell of ethanol was, in their harmonic language, the acoustic equivalent of a screaming child in a library. Kale considered this a feature. He walked the curved glass corridor of Pelagius Station alone. His reflection distorted in the viewport panels that looked out onto the bruised violet atmosphere of Keth Majoris below. The gas giant filled half the sky, banded in amethyst and sulfur, and the station orbited so close that the radiation shields hummed a low B-flat that Kale could feel in the soles of his feet. He'd been on the station 11 days now. 11 days of diplomatic breakfasts where the food tasted like geometry. 11 days of polite corridor talks from Tessari officials whose crystalline faces didn't nod so much as refract at slightly different angles. 11 days of sleeping in a bed calibrated for the Pelori body plan, which meant his feet hung off one end, and his shoulders didn't fit the contour. And every morning he woke up feeling like he'd been folded and stored in a drawer. He needed to be in the chamber in 40 minutes. After that, nothing the Tessari Harmonium did would matter, because the evidence would be part of the public record, distributed across 9 relay networks simultaneously. 3 years of documentation, compressed into a 20-minute testimony slot. 40 minutes from now, 12 human settlements would either keep their future or lose it. He checked his datapad as he walked. The testimony file was loaded, encrypted, backed up to 3 local caches. He'd rehearsed the presentation 9 times. He could deliver it in his sleep, and had twice, according to his cabin's environmental log, which had recorded him talking to an empty room at 3 in the morning. His diplomatic suite was on Deck 9, a courtesy allocation. The Concorde gave human delegates quarters with actual doors, instead of the membrane portals most species preferred. Kale appreciated the door. It had a lock. It had a handle. It was a rectangle of honest metal in a station built from grown crystal and singing polymers, and when he closed it behind him, it made a satisfying thunk that told the universe, "This space is mine." He thunked the door shut. The room was small, 10 meters by 6. But it had a window that looked out on Keth Majoris, and after 11 days the view had become something like a friend. The gas giant didn't judge. It didn't have an agenda. It just rolled its violet bands and radiated enough energy to power a civilization. And Kale respected that kind of quiet competence. He set his datapad on the desk and pulled his jacket off. The testimony, 3 years of work. Tessari mining operations in the Vallis Corridor. Human settled space. Legally recognized under the 7th Compact. The Tessari hadn't invaded. They didn't do things so crudely. They'd simply begun harvesting the asteroid fields that human settlements depended on for raw materials, reclassifying them as resonance mineral deposits under an old Tessari cultural heritage statute that predated the Compact by 2,000 years. The statute gave the Tessari legal claim to any natural formation that produced harmonic resonance in the 440 to 808 Hz range. And, since every asteroid in the universe vibrates at some frequency, if you measure it precisely enough, the statute was essentially a blank check to take anything they wanted. Elegant, bloodless, the kind of theft that wore a suit and cited precedent. Except the statute was fake, fabricated 9 months ago in a Tessari judicial archive, backdated with harmonic signature spoofing to look 2,000 years old. Kale had the checksums, the spoofing artifacts, the communication logs between the Tessari Ministry of Cultural Patrimony and the mining consortium that funded the operation. 20 minutes at the podium, and 40,000 people in 12 settlements would keep their homes. He was unbuttoning his shirt when the room changed. It wasn't dramatic. There was no flash, no sound. The light shifted. The warm amber of the suite's human spectrum fixtures tilted toward something colder, bluer, and the walls, which had been matte composite, now carried a faint crystalline grain, as if frost had formed beneath the surface. The door handle, when Kale turned to look at it, was gone. The door was still there. The rectangle, the frame, But where the handle had been, there was only smooth, unbroken surface. A wall pretending to be a door. He crossed the room in 3 steps and put his palm flat against it. Warm, immovable. Pressed harder, shifted his weight into it. Nothing. Sweet access, he said aloud. The room's environmental system didn't respond. The console panel beside the door was dark. Not off but absent. The surface where it had been now smooth crystal. Cale stood very still. He was, by training and temperament, a man who cataloged before he panicked. The windows were intact. The furniture hadn't moved. His datapad was on the desk. The air tasted the same. Recycled, faintly metallic, with the station's signature undertone of ozone. But the light was wrong, and the walls had that crystalline texture that he recognized from every Tessari structure he'd ever been inside. A living material. Architecture that grew. They'd converted the room. Tessari resonance architecture seeded somehow into the composite walls, grown over the existing structure, like a shell over a nut. The door was sealed. The comms were dead, and somewhere he was sure. Someone very elegant and very certain was watching him through the crystal itself. "All right," Cale said to the empty room. "Let's see what you've got." What they had was patience. 20 minutes, nothing happened. Cale tried everything. The windows, sealed. The viewport glass fused to the crystal overlay, and when he hit it with the desk chair, the crystal absorbed the impact with a low chime and didn't crack. His datapad, no network signal, the crystal blocking all transmission frequencies, though the local files were intact. He checked that it was sealed. The closet, sealed. The ventilation grill above the bed, covered in crystal. And when he pressed his ear to it, he could hear the air system running behind it, tantalizingly close. Completely inaccessible. The room was a box, and it held him like a fist. He sat on the edge of the bed and drank from his flask. The whiskey was warm and sharp, and it steadied the part of his brain that wanted to start punching crystalline walls. He thought about his mother, who'd been a structural engineer on the Valis 3 habitat. She used to say that every problem was just a door you hadn't found yet. She also used to say that some doors needed to be kicked, which was more relevant right now. 23 minutes to the session. He was calculating whether the bathroom pipes might run behind a thinner section of the crystal overlay when the sound came. A harmonic, pure, glassy, multi-layered, like a chord played on crystal stemware the size of buildings. Cale felt it in his teeth before he heard it in his ears. The air in the center of the room thickened, not with fog, but with a density, a wrongness, as if space itself was being pinched from both sides, and something was pushing through the gap. Then there was another Cale Vasik standing in the middle of the room. He was wearing the same shirt, the old one, half unbuttoned, not the fresh one Cale had been about to put on. His hair was the same unwashed mess. His face was the same, down to the razor nick on his left jaw from this morning, and the small scar on his right eyebrow from a childhood accident involving a bicycle and a sharp opinion about gravity. He was standing with his weight on his right foot, the way Cale always stood when he was confused. And he was staring at Cale with an expression that Cale recognized instantly because he'd seen it in every mirror he'd ever owned. Irritated bewilderment. The other Cale started. "Fracture field," Cale said. He'd read about them in a classified Concord intelligence brief that he was not technically supposed to have seen but had, because a pylori analyst had left a datapad unattended during a reception, and Cale had the reading speed and the moral flexibility to take advantage. Tessari temporal disruption technology.
You're at it.
Or so, the brief had said. Supposedly banned under the Concord's 12th provision. It didn't create clones. Pulled versions of the same person from adjacent moments in time, seconds apart, minutes apart, maybe more, and collapsed them into the same present. Copies were real. They were him. They just weren't from right now. The other Cale looked down at his own hands, turned them over, flexed his fingers, then looked back up. "How far? You're wearing the old shirt. You're me from 20 minutes ago, maybe 25. Before the room changed. Before he turned in a slow circle, taking in the crystalline walls, the sealed door, the missing handle. His face went through the sequence Cale's had. Confusion, recognition, cold anger. Cale watched it happen and felt a strange doubling, watching his own emotional process from the outside, like reading a transcript of his own thoughts. "The session," 20 said, Kale had already decided to think of him as 20 for the time gap. 17 minutes. Can we? No. Everything sealed. Comms are dead. Tried the windows, the vents, the bathroom. Still overlay on everything. 20 swore. A specific compound profanity involving the Tesseri delegate's mother and an improbable act of crystallography that Kale had invented during a particularly frustrating trade negotiation 2 years ago. He recognized it as one of his own favorites. Of course he did. We need to get out, 20 said. Aware. Don't be condescending, I'm you. I know. That's why I'm being condescending. The harmonic came again. The air pinched. A third, Kale appeared, this one wearing the fresh shirt, hair damp, a towel over one shoulder. He looked like he'd been about to walk out the door. Future Kale. Maybe 10 minutes ahead. From a version of events where the room hadn't changed yet. Or maybe from a version where it had changed differently. Oh, you have got to be kidding me, the third one said. He dropped the towel on the bed, looked at Kale, looked at 20, and his expression cycled through surprise, comprehension, and annoyance in about 3 seconds flat. Welcome to the party, Kale said. Fracturefield? Fracturefield. How many? Fresh Shirt asked, already scanning the room, already cataloging the sealed exits, already doing the same thing Kale had done because he was Kale, and that was what Kale did. So far, give it a minute. He was right. Over the next 4 minutes, 4 more versions of himself materialized in the room, each preceded by the same crystal harmonic, each arriving from a slightly different moment in the timeline. One mid-bite of a protein bar, jaw working, crumbs on his shirt, one holding a comb, frozen in the act of dragging it through his hair, one in the middle of what appeared to be a stretching exercise, one arm across his chest, caught in a position that looked absurd the instant he realized he had an audience, and one, the oldest looking of all of them, with deeper lines around his eyes and a mottled bruise on his left cheekbone that Kale didn't remember getting, who appeared already sitting in the desk chair, legs crossed, hands folded in his lap, watching the others with the weary patience of a man who had been through this before and was tired of explaining how it ended. 7 Kales, 10 meters by 6. The room hadn't been spacious to begin with, and now it felt like a closet at a convention for stubborn men, said the one with the bruise. Kale thought of him as old Bruce from the desk chair. Before you all start shouting, I've already been through the shouting part. It doesn't help. How far forward are you? Kale asked. Far enough to know how the next 20 minutes go if we waste them. Sit down, all of you. Nobody sat down. 7 versions of the same stubborn man stood in a room designed for one, and immediately began talking over each other. The noise was extraordinary, not loud exactly, but layered, like hearing the same radio station played 7 times at slightly different delays. Kale could hear his own verbal tics coming back at him from 6 directions. The way he started sentences with look, the way he interrupted himself mid-thought, the way he got louder when he felt unheard. The argument was spectacular. It was also entirely predictable, which made it worse. 7 instances of personality meant 7 instances of the same conviction, that he was the one thinking most clearly. 20 wanted to work on the door, brute force, find a seam in the crystal overlay, pry it open with the desk chair's metal legs. Fresh Shirt wanted to find a way to boost the datapad's signal through the crystal, using the room's power conduits as an antenna. Team Bar wanted to sabotage the room's environmental system to trigger an emergency maintenance response. Comb and Stretching were already in a heated debate about whether the fracture field itself could be reversed by finding its resonance frequency and generating a counter-harmonic. And they were disagreeing about what that frequency would be, because each one remembered a slightly different version of an article read 3 years ago on a transport ship, and neither would concede that the other's memory might be more accurate. Old Bruce watched from the chair, saying nothing, his bruised face carrying an expression that Kale would later identify as the look of a man watching a fire he'd already survived. Kale, the original, the one who'd been here first, though he was increasingly unsure what first meant when you shared a room with your own timeline, stood by the window and let them argue. He was watching the clock on his datapad. 12 minutes until the session opened. Listen, he said. Nobody listened. 6 versions of himself kept talking, And Kale experienced the unique humiliation of being ignored by his own face. "Hey!" He said it louder, sharper, with the edge he used in trade negotiations when the other side was stalling. Teen Bar and 20 stopped mid-sentence. The others trailed off. "We have 12 minutes before the session starts. If nobody from the human delegation presents the counter-evidence, the Tessari statute stands. The mining claim goes through. 12 settlements lose their resource base. 40,000 people lose their livelihoods, their futures, eventually their homes. We all know this. Every one of us knows this, because we're the same person who's been carrying for 3 years." "We know," said 6 voices, overlapping like a bad chorus. "Then stop arguing about the resonance frequency of a theoretical field that none of us actually understands and start thinking about why they did this. Not the imprisonment, the copies. Why would the Tessari use a banned weapon that creates more of the person they're trying to stop?" Silence. 7 minds. The same mind technically, running the same cognitive architecture on the same hardware, chewing on the same question. Kale could almost feel the gears turning in 6 other skulls. Because they were his gears, and he knew the sound they made. Fresh Shirt spoke first. "They need me to miss the session. That's the whole point. Testimony window is fixed. If I don't print in the next 12 minutes, the claim goes to default judgment." "Obviously," said Combe. "Why the copies? They could have just locked the door. They did lock the door. Crystal overlay would have been enough." "Because locking the door is crude," Old Bruce said from the chair. He uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, and the chair creaked in a way that sounded like punctuation. "Tessari don't do crude. They do elegant. They do solutions that solve themselves. So actually think, about what a fracture field does to a species like ours." Kale saw it. He saw it because he knew himself, and he'd been watching 6 copies of himself do exactly what the Tessari expected for the last 5 minutes. "It makes us fight," he said. Old Bruce pointed a finger at him. "There it is. For any consensus-based species, the pelori, the keth ascending, the assembly itself, fracturing an individual would create 7 identical minds that reach the same conclusion instantly. 7 copies of a pelori would cooperate perfectly. They'd be out of this room in 30 seconds. The weapon would be useless against them. But you were not consensus-based." 20 finished. "We argue, even with ourselves." "Especially with ourselves," said Protein Bar, who had resumed eating his protein bar during the conversation, and was now arguing with Cum about crumbs on the bedspread, which rather proved the point. The room went quiet in a way that 7 Kales rarely achieved. Outside the window, Keth Major Roldus rolled its violet bands, indifferent to everything happening on the station in its shadow. "They've studied us," Kale said. "They know that putting 7 humans in a room, even 7 copies of the same human, creates chaos. We'll argue about the plan. We'll argue about who's in charge. We'll argue about whether arguing is productive. We'll argue about the arguing. By the time we reach any kind of agreement, the session is over and the statute stands. They don't need to keep us locked in here. They just need us to keep ourselves locked in here." "So what do we do?" Stretching asked. "Just agree?" "Can you?" Old Bruce asked. There was something in his voice, not mockery, but a specific kind of tired amusement that KL recognized as the tone he used when he already knew the answer, and wanted someone else to arrive at it on their own. "Not on everything," Kale said. "But we don't need to agree on everything. We need to agree on one thing. The testimony. The testimony. Someone gets out of this room. Someone gets to the chamber. Someone presents the evidence. That's it. That's the only thing that matters. Everything else, the how, the who, the plan, who's in charge, who has the better shirt, we can fight about forever." "Fine," said Protein Bar, swallowing. "So who goes?" And immediately 7 hands went up. Fruit. The argument that followed was different from the first one. It had the same heat, the same stubbornness. They were all the same man, after all, and that man had never once in his life conceded a point gracefully. But underneath it, Kale could feel something shifting. Grudging recognition, shared among all 7 of him, that the argument itself was the weapon, and that knowing it was a weapon didn't make it any easier to put down. Fresh Shirt pointed out that he was the most presentable, showered, dressed, ready for the podium. 20 pointed out that he'd been here longest and understood the room's layout best. Teen Bar pointed out that he'd had calories most recently and would be physically sharpest. Kale, the original, as he was insisting on thinking of himself despite the philosophical problems, pointed out that he had seniority, whatever that meant among temporal copies of the same consciousness. Combs said he should go because he'd been holding a comb when he arrived. Combs were tools, and tools suggested readiness. Nobody found this argument convincing, including Combe, who abandoned it almost immediately and switched to arguing about the frequency again. Old Bruce said nothing. He sat in the chair and watched them with that bruised, patient face. And Kale found himself increasingly bothered by the bruise. Where had it come from? When had it come from? Shh. Old Bruce was from further along the timeline than any of them, which meant the bruise was from something that hadn't happened yet. You, Kale said, pointing at him. You're from the furthest forward. You know how this plays out. Some of it. Then tell us. Old Bruce was quiet for a moment. Then, he spoke, and his voice had the flatness of a man, reciting facts he'd already lived through. I can tell you that 5 of you are going to try 5 different escape plans in the next 8 minutes, and none of them are going to work. I can tell you that 20's idea about the door seam is close but not quite right. The crystal overlay regenerates faster than you can pry it. I can tell you that the fracture field has a maintenance cycle. It pulses every 90 seconds to sustain the temporal copies, and during each pulse, the crystal overlay weakens at the junction points where it meets the original composite structure. Can tell you that one person, pushing hard on the right wall panel during a pulse, can crack the overlay enough to reach the original composite underneath. And I can tell you that the Tessari monitoring this room right now are waiting for us to tear each other apart, because their behavioral models say that's what humans do when you put 7 of them in a box. How do you know the pulse timing? Old Bruce touched his bruised cheekbone, gently, the way you touch something that still hurts. Because I spent 20 minutes punching walls to find it. 7 minutes until the session. Kale looked at his copies. His selves, his others, whatever they were. They looked back. Same face, same jaw, same stubbornness carved into the lines around the mouth. The same mother's voice, somewhere in the back of the same skull, saying, "Every problem is just a door you haven't found yet." "All right," he said. "Here's what we're doing. We're not picking one person. We're all going." "The corridor outside is 40 meters to the nearest lift," Fresh Shirt said. 7 of us sprinting through a Tessari-controlled station is going to draw attention. 7 of us that they can't tell apart, Kale said. 7 of us carrying the same testimony on 7 identical datapads. 7 targets instead of 1. Running in 7 different directions. Can't stop all of us. They might. But I'd rather lose arguing on my feet than win sitting in this box. Nobody disagreed. 7 Kales, who couldn't agree on a frequency, a shirt, or the flavor of a protein bar, agreed on that. The pulse came 90 seconds later, right on schedule. Bruce had identified the weak point. A panel on the south wall, where the crystal overlay met the original door frame at a structural seam. During the pulse, the crystalline grain flickered, the blue light stuttered, and the overlay softened to something almost gelatinous. The molecular bonds loosening for a fraction of a second as the field recycled. 7 Kales hit it at once. The wall cracked. Not cleanly. The crystal splintered in long, singing shards that caught the light and threw prismatic fragments across the room. One shard cut Fresh Shirt's forearm open in a line as neat as a surgical incision. Another opened a gash across Combs' palm. Crystal dust filled the air, sharp and glittering, and Kale tasted copper and ozone. Behind the overlay, the original composite wall was still there, and the original door mechanism was still there. Hidden, not removed. And 20, who'd spent the last several minutes quietly studying the frame with the obsessive focus that Kale brought to any mechanical problem worth solving, found the manual release buried under a centimeter of softened crystal and pulled it with both hands. Ching. The door opened. Not with a thunk, but with a long grinding shriek of crystal against metal that echoed down the corridor like a scream. 7 Kale Vasics poured into the hallway of Deck 9. Tessari's response was immediate, coordinated, and precisely wrong. 2 Tessari security officers, tall, translucent-skinned beings whose bodies refracted light like living prisms, their internal structures visible as shifting geometric patterns beneath their surface, appeared at the corridor junction 20 meters away. They were carrying harmonic disruptors, elegant sidearms that looked like tuning forks and could shatter bone with targeted sound waves. They'd been stationed there. They were prepared for one fleeing human diplomat making a break for the chamber. They were not prepared for 7. The lead officer fired at Kale, the original, the one in front, though the officer had no way of knowing that. The disruptor beam hit the wall beside his head, and the composite paneling exploded into gray powder. The sound was like a bell being struck with a hammer, not the elegant chime of Tessari architecture, but a brutal crack that made Kale's ears ring. He ducked left, 20 ducked right. Fresh shirt went straight ahead, sprinting flat out, his bloody forearm leaving a trail of red drops on the polished floor. The officer's crystalline face, a structure of perfect geometric planes that the Tessari considered the pinnacle of aesthetic achievement, registered something that Kale had learned to read over years of diplomatic encounters. Confusion. Fear, not anger, confusion. The Tessari didn't do confusion. Their models didn't account for it. And now their model was failing in real time. Because the single target they'd planned for had become 7 identical targets moving in different directions at different speeds. And the harmonic calculus they used to predict threat trajectories couldn't handle the noise. 2 more shots. Protein Bar took a beam across the shoulder. Not a direct hit, but close enough. The harmonic pulse shattered something in his collarbone, and he went down hard, sliding across the polished floor with a sound that Kale felt in his own bones. Stretching, who was closest, grabbed him by the collar and dragged him behind a support column. But the other 5 were already past the junction, already splitting into 3 wordy oars. And the Tessari officers were turning in circles, their prismatic bodies flashing with distressed frequencies, trying to track targets that all looked the same and all moved with the same unpredictable human gait. Kale ran. The station's layout was burned into his memory. 11 days of walking the same corridors, memorizing turns, counting doors, noting maintenance panels, because Kale's mother had also told him to always know where the exits were, and he'd never stopped listening. The resonance chamber was 4 decks up and 6 sections starboard. The main lift was compromised. The Tessari would have locked it, but there were service shafts, maintenance accessways designed for the station's robotic cleaning units. Narrow, dark, designed for machines, not men. But a human body was a flexible thing when the alternative was failure. He found one at the end of Corridor 9-7, a panel at floor level 80 centimeters square, marked with a maintenance glyph that his datapad had translated 11 days ago as authorized automated units only. He kicked it open. Panel popped off its magnetic catches and clattered onto the floor. He crawled inside. The shaft was tight, dark, and smelled of ozone and cleaning solvent. Kale pulled himself forward on his elbows, his shirt catching on cable housings, his shoulders scraping the walls on both sides. Behind him, muffled by the shaft walls, he could hear harmonic pulses, the Tessari security teams deploying throughout Deck 9, searching for him, all of him. He wondered how many of his copies were still running. He couldn't know. The fracture field had created them as separate entities. They were him, but they were alone. The service shaft climbed vertically between decks. The transition was brutal. The horizontal crawl gave way to a vertical chimney barely wide enough for his shoulders. And Kale wedged himself between the walls and chimneyed upward, boot soles scraping against smooth composite, fingers finding grip on cable housings and pipe junctions, and the edges of structural ribs that bit into his palms. His arms burned, his fingers bled. The shaft hummed with the station's background frequency, and somewhere below, a harmonic disruptor fired, and the entire shaft rang like a struck bell, the sound bouncing up the chimney and hitting him in waves. 3 decks up, 2, 1. He found the exit panel for Deck 5, by feel. The maintenance glyphs were raised, tactile, and he'd memorized enough of the Tessari numeral system to count. He kicked the panel open and rolled out onto the floor of a secondary corridor that he recognized. The service passage behind the resonance chamber's preparation rooms. He was close, 30 meters, maybe less. He stood up. His shirt was torn. His hands were bleeding from a dozen small cuts. crystal shards and cable edges, and the sharp ribs of the chimney. Was crystal dust in his hair, and cleaning solvent on his knees. And he could feel the burn of a developing bruise on his left cheekbone, where he'd hit a pipe junction in the dark. He paused, touched the bruise, felt its shape. Oh, he thought, that's where it comes from. He heard footsteps. Fast, uneven, human. Shirt came around the corner at a dead sprint, his cut forearm wrapped in the torn-off sleeve of his shirt, his datapad held against his chest like a shield. His eyes were wild, his breathing ragged, and he looked exactly the way Cale felt, which was terrified and furious and running on nothing but stubbornness and rye whiskey. They looked at each other, the same face, battered in different places. "Made it," Fresh Shirt said, breathing hard. "How many others?" "I saw 20 take a different shaft on deck 8. Think comb got grabbed. I heard a disruptor and then shouting. I don't know about the rest. 2 of 7, maybe 3 if 20 made it up. Enough. It had to be enough." The resonance chamber's main entrance was a vast crystal archway, 4 meters tall, that hummed with the harmonic signature of every species represented in the Concord assembly. A living chord, maintained by the architecture itself, that was supposed to symbolize unity and cooperation. When Cale and Fresh Shirt approached, the archway's tone shifted. A discordant note entered the chord, something the Tessari architects had never accounted for in their harmonic design. 2 identical human signatures, arriving simultaneously slightly out of phase, creating a beat frequency that made the archway buzz like a disturbed hive. The chamber was full. 300 delegates from 47 species, arranged in concentric crystal tiers around the central podium, each tier resonating at the harmonic frequency of its occupants. The Pelori delegation, 4-armed, patient, their broad faces unreadable, occupied the 3rd tier. The Keth ascending, massive, slow-moving, their mossy bodies more landscape than creature, filled the moderator's alcove like a living hillside. And the Tessari delegation occupied the highest tier. 7 tall, prismatic figures whose bodies caught the chamber's light and scattered it in calculated patterns across the walls. The lead delegate, Ambassador Solon, stood at the tier's edge, and even from the chamber floor, Cale could see the subtle shift in Solon's crystalline structure. A darkening, a contraction of the internal geometric patterns that indicated surprise. The speaker, the Keth ascending in the moderator's alcove, rumbled a low tone that the translation system rendered as, "The floor recognizes the human delegation." Cale walked to the podium. Fresh Shirt walked beside him. Their boots left scuffs on the crystal floor, and the sound was human and crude and entirely deliberate. The chamber stirred. 300 delegates watching 2 identical humans, one with a torn shirt and bleeding hands, one with a blood-soaked sleeve tied around his forearm, approach the central podium was not within standard assembly protocol. "Honored speaker," Cale said. His voice was steady. His hands were not, but the podium hid them, and he pressed his bleeding palms flat against its crystal surface and felt it hum against his skin. "I am Cale Vasik, systems engineer and designated representative of the Vallis Corridor settlements. I am here to present counter-documentation to the Tessari cultural heritage claim on the Vallis Corridor asteroid fields." "There appear to be 2 of you," the speaker observed, in a tone that managed to convey both the weight of millennia and a certain dry curiosity. "There were 7 of us 20 minutes ago," Cale said. "Tessari delegation can explain why." The chamber went silent. The kind of silence that 300 alien delegates produced was not the absence of sound. It was a harmonic null, a collective dropping of frequency that left the air feeling hollow, as if the room itself had held its breath. Ambassador Solon's crystalline body chimed, a rapid, complex sequence that the translation system struggled with before rendering. "The human delegate is experiencing a medical episode. The Tessara Harmonium suggests a recess for treatment and observation." "I'm not experiencing a medical episode," Cale said. "I'm experiencing a Tessari fracture field, which was deployed in my diplomatic quarters 40 minutes ago to prevent me from attending this session. Fracture field, which is banned under the Concord's 12th provision, Section 9, creates temporal duplicates of the target. Tessari Harmonium used it on me because they knew that multiple copies of a human would argue with each other until the testimony window expired." He paused. The chamber hummed with the low vibrations of 300 species processing this information in 300 different ways. They were almost right, he said. We did argue. We argued about the plan. We argued about who should come. We argued about whether arguing was the problem. And then we argued about that. Here's the thing about humans, Ambassador Solon. He looked up at the Tessari tier. Solon's crystalline body was cycling through frequencies, rapid shifts from deep blue to pale violet to a white so bright it hurt. The Tessari equivalent of a flushed face, a racing heart, a crack in the composure. You can split us in half, and both halves will fight you. You can split us into 7, and all 7 will find a way to this room. Not because we agreed. Not because we reached consensus, we didn't. I still think Fresh Shirt here should have gone left instead of right on deck 7. And he thinks I climbed too slowly, and we're both right. And it doesn't matter. We came because every single version of me would rather crawl through a maintenance shaft with bleeding hands than let you steal what belongs to 40,000 people who trusted me to be here today. He put his datapad on the podium and activated the testimony file. Tessari Cultural Heritage Statute cited in claim TH4471 is a fabrication. The archive entry was created 9 months ago, backdated using harmonic signature spoofing to simulate a 2,000-year provenance. I have the original archive checksums, the spoofing artifacts, and communication logs between the Tessari Ministry of Cultural Patrimony and the mining consortium that funded the operation. Full documentation is now uploading to the Assembly's public record. The data projected above the podium. Columns of archive hashes, communication transcripts, timestamped analyses, frequency comparisons that showed the forged harmonic signature degrading under analysis. 3 years of work displayed in light above a podium in a crystal chamber, orbiting a gas giant, while a battered man with bleeding hands held on to the edges and refused to let go. Behind him, the chamber door opened again. 20 walked in, limping badly, 1 boot missing, lost somewhere in a service shaft between deck 8 and deck 6. His data pad held above his head like a banner. Then another door. A service entrance at the side of the chamber that delegates never used, reserved for maintenance robots and, apparently, for humans who didn't care about protocol. Stretching came through it. Half-carrying protein bar, whose left arm hung at an angle that made Kale's stomach clench with sympathetic pain. Teen Bar was conscious, though. He was pale, sweating, his jaw clenched, so hard Kale could see the muscles standing out in his neck. He was holding his datapad in his good hand, and he walked the last 10 meters to the podium under his own power, because Kale Vasic did not get carried anywhere. 5 of 7. 5 identical humans, battered, bleeding, crystal-dusted, each carrying the same evidence. They stood around the podium in a loose semicircle. And the chamber's harmonic architecture hummed with the discordance of 5 identical signatures. And the sound was ugly and beautiful and impossible to tune out. Ambassador Solon's body was ringing now, a high, discordant chime that the translation system didn't even attempt to render. The other Tessari delegates had drawn back from the tier's edge, their prismatic bodies dimming, pulling their scattered light inward as if trying to become smaller. The speaker's rumble filled the chamber like thunder heard through stone. The testimony is entered into the public record. Distribution to relay networks is already in progress, I am informed. Kale looked at Fresh Shirt. Fresh Shirt nodded, a small, tight grin on his face. He'd triggered the broadcast the moment they'd entered the chamber. Not from the podium, but from the service corridor, through a maintenance terminal that the Tessari hadn't thought to seal, because who would broadcast legally protected testimony through a cleaning robot's network access point? A human would. Specifically, a human who was also 4 other humans, who were also all the same human, and who had collectively decided, while arguing about everything else under the stars, that redundancy was not a weakness but a feature. The session continued. There were formal motions, procedural objections, a Tessari counterstatement that the translation system rendered in a tone of crystalline indignation that gradually shaded into crystalline desperation. None of it mattered. The evidence was in the record, in the relay networks, propagating outward at light speed toward 9 systems, where 40,000 humans lived on asteroids that the Tessari had tried to steal with a forged document and a singing weapon. Kale sat in the human delegational sphere, a low bench at the chamber's edge, sized for one. 5 of him sat on it, pressed shoulder to shoulder, knees touching, each one quietly furious and quietly proud and quietly in pain. And for a few minutes, none of them argued about anything at all. Kale could feel the warmth of his own body on both sides, and then the sensation was strange and oddly comforting, like being held by someone who understood him completely because they were him. After the session, the Concord Security Directorate, a joint commission not Tesseract-controlled, arrived to investigate the fracture field deployment. Kale gave his statement. All 5 of him gave their statements, separately, in 5 different interview rooms, and the investigating officer, a Pelori whose 4-armed body language suggested a level of professional exhaustion that transcended species barriers, later noted in her report that the 5 statements agreed on all material facts and disagreed on literally everything else, including the color of the corridor walls, the number of disruptor shots fired, the exact timing of the wall breach, and whether the protein bar had been beef-flavored or mushroom. "Is this normal for your species?" the Pelori asked. All 4 hands spread in a gesture that needed no translation. "Fortunately," said all 5 Kales, at once, in the same tone with the same half-smile. The fracture field was dismantled 12 hours later by a joint technical team under Concord supervision. The copies, 20, fresh shirt protein bar, stretching, faded as the field collapsed, their temporal threads snapping back to their original moments like released springs. It wasn't painful, they said. It was like waking up from a dream you couldn't quite hold on to. Old Bruce had never made it to the chamber. Kale learned later that he'd been captured on Deck 7, taken down by 3 Tessari security officers, and had spent the entire detention period sitting calmly in a holding cell, saying nothing, because he'd already known, from his position further along the timeline, that the others would make it. He'd known because he was the version of Kale who'd already lived through all of it. The bruise on his cheekbone was from the pipe junction in the maintenance shaft, the same bruise that Kale now carried on his own face. Combe hadn't made it either, caught on Deck 9, close to the super, having gone back slack for something. Kale never learned what. Some version of himself had made a choice that the rest of him didn't understand, and that felt, in its own way, like the most human thing about any of it. That left Kale, the original, if that word meant anything anymore. He stood in his diplomatic suite, restored now, the crystal overlay stripped away by the technical team, the door handle replaced, the walls back to their honest matte composite, the console panel glowing its familiar amber, and looked at the room that had held 7 of him. It was small, 10 meters by 6, a box, but it hadn't held him. He sat on the edge of the bed and took the flask from his boot. The whiskey was half gone. The copies had apparently found it too, because of course they had, because they were him. He drank what was left, and it burned all the way down, and the burn felt like the most real thing on the entire station. His datapad chimed. A message from the Vallis Corridor settlements. The news had already reached them, carried on the relay networks at light speed across the cold dark, between stars. The mining injunction had been filed. The Tessari claim was suspended pending full investigation. 40,000 people could keep mining their asteroids, keep building their habitats, keep raising their children in pressurized corridors with recycled air and artificial sunlight and the stubborn human conviction that anywhere you could live was home. Kale set the empty flask on the desk and looked out the window at Keth Magoris. The gas giant's bands were shifting, amethyst deepening to indigo, sulfur brightening to gold, and the station's radiation's shields hummed their low B flat, and somewhere in the resonance chamber the harmonic signature of the human delegation was still echoing in the crystal architecture, discordant and stubborn and impossible to tune out. The Tessari had assumed that splitting a human into 7 pieces would create 7 problems that canceled each other out. They weren't wrong about the problems. 7 Kales had been 7 problems, for each other, for the Tessari, for the Concord Assembly's seating arrangements, and for one very tired Pelori investigator who'd had to write the same interview 5 times. 7 of him had argued about the plan, the approach, the frequency, the shirt, the protein bar, the fundamental nature of temporal identity, and the correct method of crawling through a maintenance shaft. 7 problems that all wanted the same thing, that all carried the same 40,000 people on their shoulders, that all felt the same burn of cheap whiskey and the same ache of bleeding hands and the same quiet fury at being told to sit down and be reasonable. 7 problems like that didn't cancel each other out. They multiplied. Cale closed his eyes and leaned back on the bed. The mattress was wrong for his body. Pylori contours, as always. But he was tired enough that it didn't matter. Tomorrow there would be hearings. Formal complaints. A Tessuri countermotion, probably. A diplomatic incident that would generate correspondence for months and legal challenges for years. And at least one very long report from a very tired Pylori. He'd handle it. One of him was enough. But it was good to know that in a pinch, 7 would do.